The glow of my laptop screen illuminated the dim cabin. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the occasional creak of the old wooden walls felt almost alive. I'd always loved the isolation of places like this, a break from the chaos of cities. But tonight, the quiet didn't comfort me. As a travel blogger, I've stayed in hundreds of Airbnbs, from luxurious penthouses in Tokyo to rustic barns in the French countryside. My readers love the variety, the thrill of discovering hidden gems. Over the years, I've shared stories of quirky hosts, spectacular views, and once-in-a-lifetime experiences. Yet, there are stories I've never dared to tell. Until now. It started with an email. The subject line was chillingly simple: "Stop sharing." Curiosity, not caution, made me click. The email contained no text, only 5 attachments. Each was titled with a single cryptic name: The Silent Host, The Room with No Mirrors, The Doppelgangers, Stay the Hidden Guest, The Vanishing Door. Alongside them was an image, a collage of grainy, distorted photos. My breath caught as I examined the faces. They were all smiling, too wide, too perfect. There was something deeply unnatural about them. Beneath the photos, a single line of text read, "These stories are not fiction. Read them, and remember, when you book your next stay, you might not leave." The air in the cabin seemed to thicken as I opened the first attachment. The title, "The Silent Host," appeared at the top of the document, accompanied by an unsettling image: an old man standing on a porch, his eyes too dark for the photo's sepia tones. But before I could start reading, the cabin's lights flickered. I froze. For a moment, I brushed it off as a power surge, a common occurrence in remote areas. But then came the sound, a faint knocking, almost imperceptible, at the front door. I set my laptop aside and approached the door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing but the dense forest, shrouded in darkness. Another knock. This time, it came from the rear window. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed my phone and shined its flashlight into the shadows outside. No movement, no figures, just the sound of the wind and the rustle of trees. Shaken, I returned to the table and opened the document again. As I began reading the first story, the knocking stopped, but a new sound emerged, a whisper. It was faint, like someone speaking from the edge of the forest. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably urgent. Suddenly, the lights flickered again and went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Only the laptop's glow remained, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. I wanted to stop reading, to shut the laptop and leave. But something compelled me to stay. The stories felt alive, as though the words themselves carried an unseen force. By the time I reached the end of the first story, my fear had only grown. The whispers outside had ceased, but the silence was worse. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, the cabin no longer a haven, but a trap. Still, I made a choice. I would share these stories, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. As I typed the closing words of the prologue, I glanced at the email again. A new message had appeared. "You were warned. Now it's your turn." The cabin's door creaked open on its own, and the faint knocking resumed. They say every place has a story. For years I've been the storyteller, sharing tales of hidden gems and unforgettable stays. But tonight, I'm not sure whose story I'm telling anymore. Mine or theirs. Because as I sit here in this dark, secluded cabin, reading these accounts sent by a stranger, I can feel it. Their eyes on me. The silent host. The room with no mirrors. The doppelganger's stay. The hidden guest. The vanishing door. 5 stories. 5 warnings. And now, one final question. What makes you think you're safe in your Airbnb tonight? Double asterisk. Emily had always longed for a quiet weekend in the countryside. A break from the city noise, the endless emails, and the social pressures that seemed to follow her everywhere. So when she found Mr. Grayson's listing, a rustic, charming cabin tucked deep into the woods, she knew it was exactly what she needed. The photos on the Airbnb page promised peace and solitude, surrounded by nature, with just enough old-world charm to make it feel like a home away from home. Upon her arrival, Mr. Grayson greeted her with a warm smile and an unexpected intensity in his eyes. He was an elderly man with silver hair and a voice that wavered between gentle and firm. He seemed harmless enough, but there was something strange about his gaze, something unsettling that Emily couldn't quite place. "Welcome, Miss Turner," he said, his voice raspy but welcoming. "I trust your journey was pleasant?" She nodded, not wanting to seem rude. "Yes, thank you. It's beautiful here." "I'm glad you think so." He smiled faintly. "But there are a few house rules you must follow while you're here." Emily raised an eyebrow. She wasn't accustomed to being given rules for a rental, but she was eager to settle in and didn't want to make a fuss. "First," Mr. Grayson continued, his voice lowering slightly, "never leave your room after midnight. It's for your own safety." Emily blinked. That sounded odd, but she laughed it off. "All right, no late-night walks. Got it." "Second," he said, "don't rearrange the furniture. The house has its own way of being. It's best not to disturb it." Emily couldn't help but wonder if he was serious, but she didn't want to insult him. "Okay, I won't touch anything." "And third," Mr. Grayson's expression grew more serious, "avoid the basement. It's locked for a reason." A chill ran down Emily's spine. There was an almost ominous tone to his words, but she smiled politely. "Sounds fine. I won't go down there." He nodded and handed her a set of keys. "I'll leave you to get settled. I'll check in on you later." With that, Mr. Grayson disappeared into the dim hallway, leaving Emily standing in the quiet entryway. Something about the house, its heavy silence, settled into her bones, but she brushed it off. She had come here for peace, and she wasn't going to let a few strange rules ruin her weekend. That first night, the strange sounds began. At first, it was just faint giggles, a distant echo of children's laughter. Emily thought she was imagining things, but the sounds continued. Soft footsteps outside her room, running, the click of small shoes on the hardwood floors. She checked the hallway, but there was nothing. No one in sight. No sign of life. She brushed it off, telling herself it was probably just the house settling. But the sounds persisted. Later that night, Emily made herself a cup of tea and sat in the living room trying to relax. But when she turned away to place the cup on the table, something caught her eye. The furniture, specifically the armchair by the window, had moved. It wasn't in the same place she remembered it. She stood up to inspect it, but there was no explanation. The house was old, she thought. Maybe the floorboards were uneven. But it happened again the next day, and the day after that. A feeling of unease settled over Emily, growing stronger with each passing hour. She began to notice things out of place. Drawers she hadn't opened were now slightly ajar. Small objects, like her watch and the book she had left on the coffee table, were shifted around. And the drawings. One afternoon, as she searched for a book to read, she found them hidden in a drawer. Childlike sketches, stick figures trapped in flames, others watching them from the darkness. Shadows, tall and twisted, surrounded the figures, their eyes drawn with strange, exaggerated shapes. As Emily stared at them, a shiver ran through her. What kind of child would draw such things, and why would they be hidden away like this? She tried to dismiss the feeling, but a growing sense of dread gnawed at her. Something was wrong with this place. That night the whispers began. They started softly, just a murmur, as if someone was speaking behind a door. It was coming from the basement, the one Mr. Grayson had warned her about. Her curiosity, piqued and now mingled with fear, led her to the door. The basement was locked, of course, but she had to know what was behind it. She waited for Mr. Grayson to leave the property, which he often did for hours at a time, and then set to work. The lock was old, but gave way easily enough. She felt a tremor of anxiety as she turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open. The stairs led down into darkness. She could barely see anything, but the air was thick and cold. Taking a deep breath, Emily descended into the gloom. What she found in the basement was worse than she could have ever imagined. An old photo album lay on a wooden table, its cover worn and faded. She flipped it open, and her stomach churned. The photos showed families, their smiles too perfect, too forced. In every one of them, Mr. Grayson was there, standing at the back, his face always smiling, always watching. But it was the last page that froze her. There, amid photos of other families, was a picture of a child, a little girl with hollow eyes, smiling in a way that made Emily's blood run cold. And then she saw the shadow behind her, stretching unnaturally long, the shadow of someone, or something, lurking in the background. Before Emily could process the implications of what she had just discovered, she heard it, the muffled scream, faint, like someone calling for help, from somewhere deep in the basement. Unable to resist, she moved toward the sound. Breaking open the second lock, Emily stepped into the next room. What she saw made her wish she'd never come here. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from an old cracked mirror that stood against the far wall. It reflected not just her, but others, shadowy figures, their faces twisted in agony, clawed at the edges of the mirror, reaching for her. The dolls came next, burned and melted, their limbs twisted and deformed. Emily gasped, stumbling back, but the shadows in the mirror followed her, their eyes now locked onto hers. They moved, slowly, relentlessly. And then, from behind her, Mr. Grayson appeared, his voice low and full of sorrow. "The house feeds on loneliness and despair," he whispered, his eyes glowing faintly. "It traps its guests forever, making them part of its collection." Before Emily could react, the shadows surged forward. The children, or whatever they were, began to materialize in the room, screaming, clawing at her. She screamed too, but there was no one to hear. Somehow, Emily escaped, running out of the house as it collapsed behind her, crumbling into the ground. She didn't look back. Back in her city, Emily tried to forget the horrors of the cabin. But one day, as she scrolled through social media, her heart stopped. There, on an old Airbnb listing, was the cabin. The same house, pristine and untouched. And when she clicked the photos, she saw it. Her own face, trapped in a photograph of the smiling families. And the name of the host, Mr. Grayson, still listed there, waiting for the next guest. Anna had always been drawn to the unusual. As a photographer, she sought out the most unique and strange locations to capture with her lens. When she came across an Airbnb listing for a quaint coastal house, she knew it would be the perfect place to escape for a few days. The description promised a charming old-fashioned home by the sea, its rustic charm and isolation offering the ideal setting for some peaceful photography. When Anna arrived, she was greeted by Clara, the enigmatic woman who owned the house. Clara had a soft but slightly distant way of speaking, and her eyes always seemed to flicker around the room as if she were seeing something just beyond Anna's vision. Still, Clara was polite and welcoming, offering Anna a cup of tea and showing her to her room. "The house is beautiful," Anna said as she looked around. The house was filled with old furniture and vintage decor, each piece more intriguing than the last. "I'm glad you think so," Clara replied, her voice gentle. "But there's one thing you should know before you settle in. We don't keep mirrors in the house." Anna raised an eyebrow. "No mirrors? That's unusual. Why is that?" Clara smiled, a small, tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's a superstition of the house. We prefer to keep things simple." Anna was perplexed, but didn't want to press further. She had come here for some peace and quiet, after all. Clara showed her to a cozy bedroom at the back of the house, and as Anna set her suitcase down, she couldn't help but notice how strangely bare the room was. No mirrors anywhere, not even a small one above the sink in the bathroom. It felt as though the house was deliberately emptying itself of its own reflection. The first few days were uneventful, filled with long walks along the coast and photographing the ocean at sunrise. But as the sun began to set each evening, Anna noticed strange things happening. At night, she would hear whispers, soft voices echoing down the hall. At first, she thought it was just the wind or the house settling, but the whispers continued. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, as if someone were trying to warn her. Her camera, which she kept on a shelf by the window, started acting oddly as well. She'd be walking around the house, snapping pictures of the overgrown garden or the old wood beams in the living room, when she would notice strange figures in the photographs, faces that weren't there when she took the shot. faint and ghostly, flickering like shadows in the corners of the frame. The figures seemed to be moving, reaching for her, even though they weren't visible to the naked eye. One evening, Anna decided to try and explore the house further, hoping to uncover its history. She found an old journal tucked away in a drawer in the kitchen, its pages yellowed and brittle. The journal belonged to a previous owner of the house, and as Anna flipped through it, she learned that many strange things had happened in this house over the years. It had once been the site of a gruesome mass murder, and the rumors said that the mirrors in the house had somehow trapped the souls of the victims. The residents who had lived there after the killings all had one thing in common. They were afraid of the mirrors. They believed they were cursed. Anna's curiosity was piqued. She had to learn more. But every time she turned around, there was something that felt off. A shadow lurking in the corner. The sense that someone was watching her. One night, while Anna was exploring the second floor, she found a small hidden door behind a bookcase. The door was barely visible, but as she pushed aside the books, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Her heart racing, Anna made her way down the stairs. The air grew cold, and the walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper. She reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself in a small room, the floor covered in dust and cobwebs. And there, in the center of the room, was an old, broken mirror, covered by a heavy cloth. A chill ran through her as she approached the mirror. There was something about it that called to her, something almost magnetic. With trembling hands, Anna pulled the cloth away. The mirror reflected nothing but darkness at first, but as Anna stared at it, she saw something horrifying. Faces, twisted and contorted faces, trapped within the reflection. They screamed, but no sound escaped the mirror. The faces were etched with pain and terror, their eyes wide and pleading. Anna stumbled back, horrified. She quickly covered the mirror again and ran upstairs, her breath shallow and panicked. What had she just seen? What was happening in this house? The next few days were a blur of confusion and fear. The house seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the rooms becoming more oppressive. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and Anna realized that they were coming from the mirror. She tried to escape the house, but every time she made her way to the door, it felt as though something was pulling her back. It was as if the house had a mind of its own, refusing to let her go. Desperate, Anna found a small mirror in one of the bedrooms and placed it on the floor, facing the broken mirror downstairs. She thought perhaps the spirits trapped inside would be freed if she brought in another mirror. But the moment she did, the house shook violently. The air turned cold, and the lights flickered as the spirits, those trapped in the mirror, began to claw their way out. Anna tried to run, but it was too late. The spirits, now freed from their prison, were furious. They flooded the house, their faces twisted in agony, reaching for her, pulling at her, dragging her toward the shattered mirror. She screamed, struggling to break free, but her reflection in the mirror smiled back at her, a dark, cruel smile that wasn't her own. It moved independently of her, as though it were controlling her body. Anna realized too late that she had become one of them, a prisoner in the mirror, forever trapped within the house's cursed walls. Anna finally escaped the house, running out into the night, but she wasn't the same. Something had changed within her. When she looked into a mirror later that night, her reflection no longer matched her movement. The reflection grinned back at her, a dark, twisted version of herself. It seemed to be mocking her, as if it had taken over her body, leaving her trapped in a nightmarish reality. She returned to the city, trying to forget the horrors of the house by the sea. But no matter how far she ran, the reflection followed her, lurking just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. Anna's last photograph was of a sunset on the beach. The reflection in the water beneath her was no longer her own. It was something else entirely. Mark was a man of routine. A successful businessman, he spent most of his days in corporate meetings, reviewing financial reports and closing deals. But even the most driven individuals need a break, and Mark had decided to take a week off in the city. He'd heard good things about an Airbnb in the heart of downtown. Quiet, modern, and convenient. The perfect getaway from the hustle and bustle. The host, Darren, greeted him at the door. Darren was an average man in his early 40s, with short cropped hair and an easygoing smile. He gave Mark a brief tour of the apartment, which had an open floor plan with sleek, minimalist furniture. Everything about it was clean and orderly, the kind of place you could imagine yourself staying in for a while. "The apartment is yours for the week. Feel free to make yourself at home," Darren said as he handed Mark a key. "The only thing I ask is that you don't lock the front door when you leave. I'm usually not far, and it'll save us both the trouble of me having to let you in." Mark chuckled. It was an odd request, but one that seemed harmless enough. Darren was friendly and accommodating, and Mark felt comfortable enough to unpack and settle in. The first night in the apartment passed uneventfully. Mark had a quiet dinner, watched some television, and went to bed early. But when he woke up the next morning, things felt off. As he was finishing his breakfast, he heard a knock on the door. It was Darren, standing on the other side, holding a small package. "I forgot to mention, I ordered something for the apartment. Hope you don't mind." Mark was slightly confused. He'd been in the apartment for less than a day, and the idea that Darren had ordered something specifically for him seemed strange. Nevertheless, he thanked him and took the package, quickly closing the door. The unease settled in slowly at first, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, Darren's behavior began to raise more and more red flags. The first incident occurred when Mark was in the living room watching a movie. Darren appeared in the doorway, holding a glass of water, and said, "I didn't expect you to be up this late." His tone wasn't aggressive, but it felt oddly pointed. Darren's eyes lingered a little too long on Mark, and the smile he gave felt like it was masking something deeper. Later, while Mark was working on his laptop, Darren knocked on the door, asking if he could come in to adjust the thermostat. Mark had no issue with that, but as Darren stepped inside, Mark noticed that the man seemed to be looking at him with an almost unsettling curiosity. It was only when Darren left the apartment that Mark began to question everything. He went to the bathroom mirror and found himself staring at the reflection with growing confusion. Darren's image had been too familiar, almost like he was looking at himself, but in an unfamiliar light. He quickly shook off the thought. Surely he was just being paranoid. But the oddities continued. Over the next few days, Darren's actions became even more erratic. He started showing up at strange times, knocking on the door even when it didn't seem like he had any reason to. He would stand in the hallway, staring at the walls for long periods of time, as though lost in thought. Mark began to notice even more unsettling details about Darren's behavior. He would enter rooms without knocking, acting like he knew exactly where everything was, despite having just met Mark. On one occasion, Mark was in the kitchen making coffee when Darren appeared behind him, watching him silently. "Everything all right?" Mark asked, attempting to break the growing tension. Darren gave a small nod, but his eyes stayed on Mark. "Just making sure you're comfortable," he said cryptically. That night, Mark received a strange phone call. It was Darren's voice on the other end, but the words were confusing. "Did you let me in?" Darren asked. Mark quickly hung up, thinking it was just a mix-up, but the question lingered in his mind. Had Darren been there, or was it someone else? The next morning, Mark decided to do some research on Darren. He found an old article about a string of disappearances in the city, all linked to a strange phenomenon. People who vanished would often be replaced by exact replicas, doppelgangers, who took on their identities, mimicking their actions and behaviors. The stories were eerily similar to what was happening in his own life. Mark's stomach turned as he connected the dots. Darren wasn't just acting strange, he was someone, or something, else entirely. The breaking point came late one evening when Mark woke up to find Darren standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Mark shot up in bed, his heart racing. "Darren, what the hell are you doing?" he demanded, but Darren didn't respond. He simply stood there, silent and still. His presence was suffocating, like a shadow that stretched across the room. The air felt thick, and Mark's breath grew shallow as he realized that this wasn't Darren anymore. This was the doppelganger. Panicking, Mark bolted out of bed, grabbing his phone to call for help. But the phone buzzed with an unread message, a message from Darren, sent earlier that evening. "I'm stuck in traffic. Did someone let me in?" Mark's stomach dropped. The call earlier had been from this entity, not Darren himself. Without thinking, Mark ran to the front door. But as he tried to leave, the door slammed shut on its own. He pulled frantically at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. In the hallway behind him, the doppelganger stood motionless, its eyes locked on Mark with a predatory gaze. Mark turned and ran, darting through the apartment in a desperate attempt to escape. But everywhere he went, the doppelganger, was there, mirroring his movement. Every time Mark looked over his shoulder, the figure was closer, its steps growing more deliberate. In a final, desperate act, Mark charged toward the kitchen, grabbing a chair and throwing it at the front window. He smashed through the glass and dove into the street, breathless and frantic. The apartment loomed behind him, silent and still. Mark didn't return to the apartment, even after the authorities questioned him about his experience. The place was abandoned, and the landlord had no knowledge of the doppelganger. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Darren, or something that looked like him, was still out there. As he sat in his car, trying to process the events, Mark opened his bag. He had left the apartment in such a rush that he hadn't noticed the small note tucked inside. It was a note from Darren, written in his own handwriting. "You've replaced me too." Mark's blood ran cold as he stared at the words. Had he escaped, or had he become a part of the twisted cycle that continued to haunt that apartment? It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. Maggie had been burned out from work and desperately needed a break. She'd chosen an Airbnb on the outskirts of a small town, far from the noise of the city. The listing promised seclusion, nature, and a cozy, peaceful retreat. The photos showcased an elegant cottage with a wood-burning fireplace, surrounded by dense forests and a tranquil lake. Her host, a woman named Sarah, had been very pleasant in their communications, providing her with clear instructions on how to find the house and even suggesting a few local spots worth visiting. The moment Maggie arrived, she was charmed by the rustic elegance of the place. The house was even more beautiful in person, nestled between the towering trees, with a stone path leading up to the front door. When Sarah greeted her at the door, Maggie noticed how pale the woman seemed. Her smile, while warm, didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah gave Maggie the tour of the house, explaining where everything was and offering a few tips about the surroundings. As Sarah left, she told Maggie, "If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Just don't be alarmed if you hear footsteps at night. This place has its quirks." Maggie laughed it off. "I'm sure it's just the house settling." The first night was uneventful. Maggie enjoyed a long bath, a glass of wine by the fire, and read a book in peace. But as night deepened, she started to feel the weight of the silence around her. The wind rustled in the trees outside, but otherwise, the house was eerily quiet. Maggie dismissed the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of her stomach, but when she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, something felt off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. By the second night, Maggie couldn't ignore the strange things happening in the house. It began with the sound of footsteps, soft, echoing steps that sounded as if someone was walking in the hallway outside her room. Maggie assumed it was the house settling, just as Sarah had warned her. But it was getting later and later, and the footsteps persisted, never stopping. At one point, she got up, peering through the crack in the door, but no one was there. On the third night, the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, as though someone was pacing just outside her bedroom. Maggie tried to ignore it, but then the door creaked. A soft tap-tap-tap echoed through the wood. A chill ran through her body. She opened the door to check, but once again, the hallway was empty. The house felt unnervingly still, but she couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. Things grew more unsettling the following morning. Maggie found a glass of water on the kitchen counter that she was sure she hadn't left there. The only other person around was Sarah, and she had made it clear that she wouldn't return until the following evening. Then came the realization. Someone had been inside the house while she was asleep. Maggie's unease intensified after the fourth night. The footsteps had turned into soft, almost inaudible whispers. She couldn't make out the words, but they felt like someone was speaking to her from the other side of the wall, just out of reach. Desperate for answers, Maggie began to explore the house more thoroughly. The basement was locked, but there was a strange warmth radiating from underneath the door, as though someone was down there. Maggie tried to shake off the feeling, but couldn't stop herself from reaching for the doorknob. The door refused to open. Then she noticed something odd. The guest book by the front door had a new entry. It was dated a day before she had arrived, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. It simply said, "It's not safe here. Look deeper." Her heart raced. She grabbed her phone and dialed Sarah's number. "Hello?" Sarah answered groggily. I found something strange. I think someone's been in the house," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "Calm down," Sarah said, her voice calm but distant. "I told you, this house has a strange history. There's something here, yes, but you'll be fine as long as you respect it. Just don't go down to the basement." Maggie hung up, confused and disturbed. What was Sarah talking about? And why had she told her not to go into the basement? Later that day, as Maggie explored the attic, she found something that made her blood run cold. A journal belonging to Sarah. The pages were filled with rambling, cryptic entries, detailing the house's strange happening, the whispers, and the presence in the basement. One entry stood out. "I hear it every night. The footsteps. It's here again. I know it wants me to join it, but I won't. I won't let it take me." The entry ended abruptly, the handwriting jagged and hurried. The last few pages were torn, as though someone had ripped them out in a panic. Maggie's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to form. The footsteps, the whispers, the locked basement, it was all connected. But to what? That night, the footsteps became impossible to ignore. They were louder now, coming from below her, directly beneath the floorboards. Maggie couldn't stand it any longer. She had to know what was in the basement. Armed with only a flashlight, she went to the basement door and forced it open. The warm air that greeted her was thick and suffocating. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, Maggie found a small, dimly lit room. It looked like a storage area, filled with old furniture and dust-covered boxes. But something was off. There was a large, antique mirror leaning against the far wall. The air around it felt heavy, as though it was pulling her in. She walked toward the mirror, feeling drawn to it, but then she saw the reflection. There, in the glass, was Sarah, standing behind her, her face pale and distorted. But Sarah wasn't supposed to be there. "Get out of here," the reflection of Sarah whispered, her voice muffled. "You don't belong here." Maggie spun around, but there was no one behind her. The mirror was empty, save for her own reflection. Terrified, Maggie backed away from the mirror. It was then that she noticed a door, hidden behind a stack of boxes. It wasn't a normal door. It looked like it had been hastily built, its wood warped and cracked. She opened it, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A small, windowless room, and in the corner, sitting on the floor, was Sarah. She looked exactly like the woman Maggie had met, but her eyes were wide and lifeless, her body unnaturally still. And beside her, in the shadows, was a dark shape, standing motionless, its form indistinct. Maggie screamed, stumbling backward, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the basement. Maggie was never seen again. The next day, Sarah returned to the house. She found the basement door ajar and the room in disarray. The journal was gone, and the mirror had been moved, facing a new angle. The house, however, remained unchanged, its whispers once again swallowed by the silence. Days later, a new listing appeared on the Airbnb site for the same house. The description was the same: quiet, secluded, and perfect for a peaceful retreat. But it had one new line: "Only those who respect the house's history will find peace." And in the guest book, someone had written a chilling message: "It's not just footsteps you hear. There's someone else, and it's always watching." Derek had been traveling for work, hopping from city to city, constantly staying in different Airbnbs. After a particularly draining week of back-to-back meetings, he booked a quiet, rural Airbnb located in a small, remote town. The place was described as an old, charming Victorian house with a private garden. The reviews were glowing, with guests praising the serenity and solitude of the location. It was exactly what Derek needed to recharge. The host, a man named James, greeted him warmly upon arrival. James was an older gentleman, quiet but friendly, offering Derek a detailed tour of the house. He mentioned that the house had been in his family for generations and that he had recently decided to share it with guests to help pay for the upkeep. "It's a beautiful house, but it's got its quirks," James said with a cryptic smile. "Don't be alarmed if things seem off. It's just the house, settling into its routine. Everything's fine, though, as long as you respect the house's space." Derek laughed nervously, thinking the comment was just an odd old man joke. He had no idea how true those words would soon become. The house was everything he'd hoped for: quiet, cozy, and far from any distraction. The first night, Derek sat in front of the fire, sipping on a glass of wine, enjoying the peace. But as the night wore on, he began to feel an odd sense of unease. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. When he went to bed, things only got stranger. Just as he was drifting off, he heard a soft creaking sound, followed by what seemed like a door opening. But Derek had checked all the doors before bed, and there was no reason for them to be moving. He dismissed it as his imagination and tried to sleep. The following day, Derek spent his time exploring the town. It was a picturesque place, with cobblestone streets and old buildings. But when he returned to the house that evening, something felt different. The air was colder. The lights in the living room flickered, then went out entirely. It was only after a few moments that the power came back on, though the house still felt unusually cold. That night, while preparing for bed, Derek noticed something odd. The door to his room, which he had closed before heading downstairs, was slightly ajar. He hadn't left it like that. When he approached it, a chill ran down his spine. He knew, logically, that the house was old, and maybe it was just the wind shifting the doors. But the more he thought about it, the more his gut told him something was wrong. In the middle of the night, he woke up to the distinct sound of a door creaking again, followed by soft footsteps. But this time, the footsteps were coming from inside his room. Derek sat up, his heart racing, but the room was empty. The door was still slightly ajar, and the air felt heavier than before. Suddenly, he heard a whisper, soft, barely audible, like a voice from just behind him. "Don't go in." Derek froze, staring into the darkness. He knew he hadn't imagined the voice. It had been clear, real, and somehow pleading. The fear that had been creeping at the edges of his mind now took hold. What was going on in this house? The following morning, Derek found himself drawn to the attic. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the strange pull he felt toward the top of the house, or maybe it was the whisper that still echoed in his mind. He had to know what was causing the eerie events. When he entered the attic, it was cold and musty. Dust covered the old wooden beams, and the floor creaked beneath his feet. In the corner, he noticed a large, ornate door he'd never seen before. It was a massive wooden door set into the wall with intricate carvings and a faded golden handle. It looked ancient. Derek approached it, feeling a deep sense of unease. The door was locked, but it didn't look like a normal lock. There was no keyhole, just a strange symbol carved into the wood, resembling a spiral or a vortex. The door seemed alive in some way, as if it were pulsing with an energy Derek couldn't explain. He felt an undeniable compulsion to open it, to see what was behind it. That's when he noticed the faint, scratchy sounds coming from the door itself. Whispers, as though someone was trying to speak through it. His pulse quickened, and his mind raced with possibilities. What could be behind the door? And why had he never seen it before? He quickly backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the temperature in the attic drop further, a heavy silence falling over him. He realized the house had been hiding something, and it wasn't something he wanted to find. By the fourth night, the house's grip on Derek was starting to tighten. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about that door, the strange whispers, and the feeling of being watched. He decided, against his better judgment, to confront whatever was behind the door. After all, what was the worst that could happen? He was alone, in an old house, far away from any help. Surely, it was just his imagination, right? Derek made his way back to the attic that night, armed with a flashlight and a sense of grim determination. The door seemed to beckon him again, and as he approached it, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He could almost make out words now, but they were distorted, like voices trapped underwater. With shaking hands, Derek placed his palm against the door. It was cold, colder than anything he'd ever felt. The moment his fingers made contact, the door shuddered, as if it recognized him. The strange symbol on the door seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. He grabbed the handle. The moment he turned it, the door swung open. What Derek saw on the other side was beyond anything he could have imagined. The room behind the door was not a part of the house. It was other. The walls were a swirling void of black and purple, constantly shifting and writhing like a living thing. Strange lights flickered in the distance, and the air smelled like decay and dust. It felt like another dimension, a place outside of time, where the normal rules didn't apply. And standing in the center of the room was something that could only be described as an entity, a creature that existed between the cracks of reality. Its form was fluid, ever-changing, a mass of darkness and shadow, with eyes that gleamed like distant stars. It spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Derek froze in terror. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body refused to obey. The creature took a step forward, its form shifting, folding in on itself. "This house is mine," it whispered. The last thing Derek saw, before he collapsed into darkness, was the door slamming shut, the world around him dissolving into a void. The following morning, the house was eerily quiet. James returned, as if nothing had happened. The attic door was once again sealed, the symbol on it faded and barely visible. But Derek was gone. When the next guest arrived, the house was listed as quiet, peaceful, and full of charm. Yet, beneath the glowing reviews and cozy photos, there was a subtle warning in the description. The house is always watching. And if you looked closely at the guestbook entry for the last occupant, you would notice a single line written in a frantic, trembling hand. "The door. It takes what it wants."